WordPress Accessibility Day 2023, Complex Data Visualizations and the Accessibility Phenomena, with speaker Merary Alvarado, Accessibility Specialist, Elena Consulting Services. This presentation was recorded September 27th, 2023.
Hey everyone, welcome back to WordPress Accessibility Day 2023. I'm Ben Ogilvy, Head of Accessibility at ArcTouch. We help companies of all sizes create lovable custom apps, websites, and connected experiences used by hundreds of millions of people every day. And I help our teams do that work with an accessibility-first approach. Thank you all so much for joining us for Complex Data Visualizations and the Accessibility Phenomenon with Merary Alvarado. Merary is an accessibility evangelist with more than 12 years of proven experience in executing, developing, and leading accessibility processes in multiple digital industries. She's a subject matter expert who contributes to accessibility by establishing guidelines, best practices, and standards related to designing and maintaining accessible websites, native apps, and data visualization. She trains clients on using accessibility monitoring software and assists in identifying strategies and solutions focused on accessibility. She's a podcaster, speaker, pet lover, and passionate about data. During the session today, please add your questions to the Zoom Q&A section, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. And you can also use the chat section to connect with other attendees. And with that, I'll hand over to Merary.
Hey, Ben, thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining. I'm really happy to be here and share with you the information that I prepare based on the best practices that I know of this area. I will really love if you can confirm that you can see the content of my screen, and also if you are able to check the information. That's great. Thank you so much. So many good signs. Okay, so talking about accessibility. When we talk about complex data visualization, we need to understand several things, right? Let's think about this. When we talk about data visualizations, what is usually your thoughts about it? So we think about two ways. We collect the information that we have about histograms, bar charts, like multiple visualizations. And the other point that we usually think about is the audience, the type of audience that is usually like accessing this information. It's usually highly technical profile roles, right? Or those are economists or mathematicians or scientific, like scientific researchers, right? So, and when we think about that, we say, okay, so the information that we need to add or we need to create, probably people with disabilities cannot use that, right? And I'm telling that because in my experience, I heard that before, okay? It's not my way to think, right? But it's important to understand that there are the type of questions or comments with accessibility all the time. So one of the first topics that I would like to share with you is always talking about that the accessibility is a human right. Why is this important to mention? Maybe people that is also involving in my previous presentations, I always talk about this topic because we cannot start creating digital accessibility spaces or digital products without thinking about that the accessibility is a human right. Why is this important to keep into consideration? Because we can create opportunities for people to live their life as they need, right? We are creating opportunities for people to be informed or get some training or obtain a new job. We don't know that, but if we can create the spaces that are accessible and also really well designed for multiple disabilities, and of course for all the users that will access your content, that is the best. And also another point that is important to discuss is like we are doing today. We are having a conversation, we are talking, people that is interested in learning and create a community focused on create digital accessible products. The other point that I would like to mention is the opportunity to create digital accessible services. And what is think about that? So we are professionals. We know our thing, right? We know what we need to do. We are good designers. We are good developers, project managers, etc. But sometimes we forgot that also we need to follow certain laws, standards, etc. around the world in order to create our sites accessible. Okay. And finally, sometimes we have a few debates with the design team or with a few designers that they say, no, it's because accessibility is an ugly thing that we can just apply in our site, but it is not. It's a myth, right? But we need to be completely clear that we can create usable accessibility spaces or usable accessibility. Okay, so we are going to talk also about two important things. Please don't forget that when we are talking about accessibility or digital accessibility, we cannot dismiss the specific language that is required to create our content. Okay, so that's why it's important to understand about disability. Disability or the disability is something that everyone has, everyone. It's not something that you need to wait when you get older. No, it's something that is always in our life. This is something that is normal, but actually it's not something that we talk about much. Okay, but it's important to discuss. The two important points. First point is that there are common internet disabilities. So, for example, vision, cognitive disabilities, hearing impairments, reduced mobility. So those are the most common disability that we can find statistically in internet that we need to think about, even when we start planning our projects. It's not when we are on the testing part, it's when we started or creating the ideas or generating the ideas to create our project. And of course, the dimensions of these disabilities. Some of them could be an impairment, which is specifically related to a composition of the body of a person, or a person is not able to like memorize the information in a fastest way, probably on the fastest ways possible, or they will be lost. And of course, some types of restrictions of participation, for example, physical spaces. Okay, so why always try to do this at the beginning of our conversations? Because we cannot forget that when we are talking about accessibility, we are talking about people. We are not talking only about the patches that I'm adding in the code with an area attribute or with a label, and that will be enough. No, we are talking about something else. Accessibility is a way of living for many users. So that's why it's important for us to understand that, okay? So based on that, I would like to refer to two concepts that for me are really important in order to review the best practices that we want to share today about the visualizations. One of these is the concept of usability. When we are talking about usability and accessibility, we think that they are separate, right? And one is one thing and the other is another thing, but actually is not. It's completely the opposite. We are talking about effectiveness. We are talking about how the product is created in the way that is meeting with the needs that I have as an user, right? In this specific or particular product. And when we're talking about accessibility, we are talking specifically in the way, how can I just definitely test if my page is really usable when we are not using the common patterns of navigation or interaction, like for example, navigating the page using a screen reader, or navigating the page using a keyboard alone, for example, or using magnification tools or braille displays. Okay, so how usable is my site when I need to use external devices or of assistive technology? So is it still usable in the way that I think it's usable? So that's why it's important. I prepare for you. Talking about usability is the ability of the user to navigate the page, understand the page, recover from errors, understand the content, and also understand that everything is intuitive. Okay? And when we are talking about accessibility, we are talking about keyboard navigation, screen reader users, magnification tools, and all the tools that will be necessary for people with disabilities to access the content. Okay, so everything that I said is really important. It's like a small summary about that. So those were my notes. So don't need any more. So in this case, what is data visualization mean to do in our conversation? So when we think about data visualization, one of the first questions that I usually try to just moderate when we want to work with designers or with developers, especially our users are going to do with this. What will be the type of decisions they need to take when we are creating visualizations? Sometimes we think that we can create the most beautiful visualization, but in general is not useful enough, or the lack of concepts that are clear is really difficult to understand. And of course, how are we going to make this accessible? So sometimes we think, okay, Merary, but how much is the percentage of people with disabilities that will use our system? And I was like, oh my God, this is not a question that I really like to answer, and I will not answer anyways. But we need to think when we are creating content that this content needs to be accessible, even if one person will access the product or 1,000 user will use our product. So we always need to think about that, but always think about what is the purpose of the visualization. Is this possible to create, or is possible to create this visualization accessible? This is the second most important question that you need to make. Okay, so what are the most common barriers that we can find or we can face when we are navigating or creating visualizations in terms of accessibility? Is that sometimes we said, okay, we're talking about visualizations. Of course, we need to prioritize the visual part. But sometimes we prioritize that so much that the navigation or understandability of the graphic, it's impossible. So visually, it's beautiful, it's presentable, but it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to use and make decisions. And of course, it's difficult to navigate. And sometimes it's lacking of a lot of context, so it's not possible to understand. On the other side, we have the color schemes. What is that? Sometimes we have beautiful colors and we have all the rainbow there, right? And we create a graphic with not a specific set of colors. So we can add all the color that I have available without restriction. There is not a pattern, or there is not a specific set or matrix using colors. So the user is able to customize everything as they can. One of the things that I would like to mention with this is that in one of the previous companies that I had, they gave the power to the users to customize everything. So one of the biggest challenges they had is that how can we just restrict a little bit more the customization in the way that when they are creating the content, they create also accessible customizations. So that's why it's necessary to create a specific set of tools that we are going to share today with you. And of course, the navigation. So we need to think about multiple ways of interaction when we are navigating with our visualizations. We need to think about keyword navigation. It's not the same to navigate our page using a laptop or a desktop keyword, right? Or using the mouse with a keyboard, or just using the keyboard itself and just the mouse pad from our laptop. All the interactions are different. So that's why we need to understand what will be also the way of the users needs to interact with our page. So those are the most common. So is the use of colors, and also the way that the users navigate or interacts with the pages. And of course, when the prioritization of the visual like components or component of the presentation, it's the priority and like a clear context. Okay, so what are the best practices that we can just find for today and we can share with you? One of the best practices that I can share with you today is like you need to humanize the data. What is the meaning of that? So think about what will be the value that we can find or we can obtain from these visualizations that I need to make in order to use the information. What will be the specific situation that I need to review with this? So always try to create the data in a way that the user will be able to understand, and try to create the content in a way that will be intuitive, right? Intuitive for the users. Why is this important? Because when we need to make decisions, there are times of the day that we can just make a decision and sometimes that is not. For example, if we have like multiple meetings during the morning and during the afternoon, I need to make a decision and I need to go to a specific visualization and I'm exhausted because I had a lot of meetings. There is a cognitive load there that probably cannot help me to create great data or make decisions correctly because I'm tired. This is something that is also necessary to think about. Mental health, invisible disabilities is something that is important when we are talking about data. So first step, humanize the data. The second point is assistive technology interaction. What is the meaning of that? So we need to be completely conscious about the use of assistive technology. If you want to start working with accessibility and you are a developer or tester, designer, project manager, that you want definitely to start working with accessibility, I really recommend you to start learning about the use or how to use a screen reader. Why is this important? Because every screen reader is different and every browser versus the screen reader is also different. The shortcuts are different to access all the information from the screen readers. So that's why it's necessary for you to understand the variations. Let me give you an example. If you want to use Edge as part of the support browser from your system, you need to understand that the best screen reader will be JAWS. And in the case of Chrome, the best screen reader will be NVDA. And those are for Windows. But what is going on if you need to test your product in Safari, in Mac? What will be the screen reader? That will be VoiceOver. But in this case, we are talking about desktop environments. But what is going on if we need to test our devices? So if we are testing in Android or we want to test our products in Android, we need to get familiar with TalkBack, which is the screen reader that is by default on the operating system. Same case with Apple devices, VoiceOver. So it's really necessary to understand why is this important. And what I'm saying that, because you will have multiple components and interactions. So for example, if you are creating a website and you are using HTML5 components, usually the screen readers are able to identify those controls or those components without any problem. That's why we are calling this part accessibility supported. So usually all the native HTML5 controls are most of the time, 90% all the time, accessible by the screen reader alone. But what is going on when you customize a component and this component is not including all the attributes to allow the screen reader to understand your content? So that's why it's necessary always to keep in mind what will be the best way to create our elements or when we are creating our visualizations. What will be the type of components that we want to create? Is the user familiar with those? Controls, for example, drop-down menus, radio groups, checkboxes, all of those are really familiar for users. But what is going on if you need to create a specific and different interaction that probably the user needs to take 10 seconds, 1 minute to think about in order to use it? Okay, so another point that I would like to mention is that the way that this elements needs to be created, or you need to think about that. We have a page and we have a banner, we have drop-down options, we have checkboxes, and visually presented when we are using CSS best practices, the content looks beautiful. But what is going on when the content itself is not properly ordered or it's not properly organized? The screen reader will not be able to understand the structure of the page. So that's why it's really important for me to share with you the accessibility tree concept. So in this case, you will be able to understand what will be the way your content can be accessed by using a screen reader. For example, on the screen, I have a screenshot of a Verizon page. And as part of the Chrome options, you can find a small icon at the top right side of the screenshot. That is a small icon, like simulated as a person, and you can enable that. So immediately you can convert your code in the way that the screen reader will read your information. So you will immediately know what will be the best way that the user can access our content. So you can just double check the code, change the components, the order of the elements, add additional attributes or roles that can help the screen reader user to understand the content in a logical and meaningful way. So that is really, really important, okay? Now, another point that is really interesting for me to know, because it is one of the most complicated and most common defects when we are navigating visualizations, is the use of keyword. What is that? We are usually get used to navigate our pages using the mouse because it's the best way. So when I work in the past, when I had some reviews with designers, we usually proceed with a few exercises. So how much time do you take, or did take, like, to go to a specific main navigation menu using the mouse? 3 seconds, 5 seconds. What will be the average time navigating the same navigation menu using your keyword alone? Keyword alone, that will be the same? Definitely no, right? So it could take 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and move. The main navigation menu have like a lot of options. So it will be really difficult, time consuming for the user to navigate the content. So that's why it's really important for you to understand that on the selection of the components, and you need to create customized components, it's also important, okay? When you create filters or when you create horizontal navigation menus, all these things needs to have a specific strategy or keyword interaction strategy. So you can create guidelines, visual guidelines, to indicate the user what will be the shortcuts, for example, to access to the horizontal toolbar or the horizontal menu bar. So what would be another topics or another 2 points that you need to consider when we are talking about keyword interaction? We already talked about native components, so are usually really good and beneficial for screen readers. But in this case, it's also necessary to understand that every native component from HTML has their own keyword interaction. It's not the same navigate using a radio group or navigate a checkbox. So you can access the checkbox using the tab key, but you need to enable the checkbox by pressing the spacebar. And in the case of radio groups, you can access to the radio group using the tab key, and you need to navigate between the radio groups using up and down arrows. Those are patterns that are also necessary to keep into consideration when you are selecting those components. Why is this important? Because it will be meaningful or not for a people that is blind, or depends on a screen reader, or also depends on keyword navigation. On the other side, when we are navigating or creating complex components, because yes, we need to customize our visualizations, our controls, it will be necessary to understand that consistency is the key. So if we are just replicate the use of one component or complex component in another visualization, we need to understand what will be the purpose of this control. So try to create a control with the same consistent navigation that will be replicable to all other sections. And 3 important points with the complex components when you are creating visualizations: structural navigation. What will be the specific structure of your visualization? So it means that the logical, meaningful navigation when the user is navigating with the tab key, for example. Then we have the spatial navigation. What will be the logical way to access to that visualization? It will be top, then down, then up, then down again. What will be the specific interaction that you are looking for with this visualization? And finally, targeted visualization. So how can we create spaces for the user to be fully concentrated in our visualization? So what we are expecting from our user in terms of navigation with or in regards of this visualization. That's why it's really important. So it's not the same to navigate through a scatter plot and through an histogram. It's not the same, right? But if we are using a similar complex components that I can use to filter the information in a scatter plot, but I can use the same component in the histogram, the consistency will be the key here. Okay, perfect. So set of best practices that can help you, the area authoring practices guide. So in this page, you will find the most accepted interaction patterns for screen readers, keyword navigation patterns for keyword users, for the HTML5 components from websites. So you can find the most important references at the W, which is the organization in charge to create the web accessibility area best practices. So in this guide, or with this guide, you will find multiple best practices you can use and incorporate in your code, or you can replicate in multiple CMS. Okay, perfect. The next point is that you need to define a control system or an accessibility matrix. Do you remember that I talked about this team that was able to create all the colors available? So you can use all of them, whatever you want. You can customize with the colors that you want, okay? But sometimes it's really difficult to say if a combination of a specific set of colors will create an action. So if we can provide this type of freedom to our customers, that will be really great. But it's always our responsibility to create best practices also that we can share to our users to create spaces that will be accessible for them. How can we do that? So we have our color palette, and we can just match what will be the contrast that we match the best with the combinations. And you can create a specific guideline that says, okay, so those colors are matching the minimum requirements in terms of colors, contrast, background, foreground, regarding to the web content accessibility guideline, for example. So you can create a specific scenario that you can share with them, and they can manipulate the information in a way that can create customized environments that are also accessible, okay? Another important point that I would like to mention is the pattern library. So what is happening if I told you that color blindness is one of the most common disability that we can find right now when we are talking about visualizations. And I'm telling you this because I was working with a specific area full of men, and most of them, incredibly, had color blindness condition, and they didn't know until they start working with the specific product of the system. So they know about that. So what will be the recommendations? Always try to create a pattern library. What is the meaning of that? Try to create a specific selection of lines, dots, icons, and also backgrounds, templates, everything that can help you to create the content in a way that can be accessible for other users, okay? So an example that I have for that is that this is a really good scenario. So we have on the screen a pie chart that is using specifically a set of colors. So this is an accessible way to present to the customer. So if you can click on the enable color patterns, you can find what will be the specific pattern or specific sections that were designed for each of the colors. Or, for example, you can define or definitely identify that each color is within a specific pattern. I was thinking about in another word, sorry. So you can see how important it is. So people that is not able to just distinguish multiple colors, you can enable small sections like this and enable like a background pattern so you can identify better your content, okay? So another point that is really interesting here is I had multiple conversations with the technical writers. And probably you said technical writers. Well, we are talking about technical writers. So the use of language that we are, let me just turn it in another way. So the language that we are using to create our components, it's also important. We talk about learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, mental health, and any other type of disability that can impact directly the opportunity to make decisions. So the content needs to be simple as much as in the technical areas that we are, right? Not in all spaces we can just change the word because probably the profile or the type of audience that will access to that information will be not familiar with that. So that is really important for us to understand that, okay? My recommendation is that always the designers and developers always try to have a technical writer or a technical person that can help you to use the specific words that will be easy to understand when you are creating customized components or your visualizations, because it will be the best way for you to create content that will be accessible and it will be easy to handle, okay? For example, on the screen, I have a screenshot of a specific dashboard, okay? So the name of the text that we use to create buttons or tab panels or to call some actions, etc., in this particular are really important. The simpler, the better. So my recommendation is always keep in mind the language. Always try to contact your technical writer. Always try to create some design critiques. This is something that is also important. So you can design a specific view, just have a conversation with the developers, have a conversations with the designers and said, what is missing here? So how can we improve this? Do you remember the question that I made at the beginning of the presentation? Is like, how can we create this accessible? Even the text, it's important, okay? So one of the last topics that I would like to share, because we only have 40 minutes and a couple of more minutes, is the accessibility user personas. So it's always necessary. When we are creating visualizations, we usually think or create personas with profiles that are extreme, highly technical profiles. And we don't think about the basic needs on accessibility. So that's why it's necessary for you to consider multiple scenarios. So usually we have the frustrations, the motivations, the type of technology they use, but what type of technology they use to access the information. So for example, they are using a laptop, they are using a desktop computer, they are using a Linux computer, right? Because this is something that is really, really common in data environments. They are using Linux as well. So are we prepared for Linux operating systems or not? And for example, what will be the needs for this person? So they need to work using like a light environment. It's better for them to. So are we prepared to create our visualizations in dark mode? That will be the best approach that we can take. So that's why it's really necessary for us to understand. So this is an example. On the screen, you have an example of a hearing impaired user where you can find many things. So I will go back to the previous slide. So because I would like to share with you some of the questions that it will be necessary to manage. Okay, so what will be the task barrier, or what will be the goal? What would you like to measure with the visualization when we are talking about user accessibility personas? Sometimes we say, okay, the way that we can understand the information, perfect, this is check, but how can we make a decision through this selection of the information? So that's why it's going to be the font size of the text that I have. It will be highly enough. Can I customize the text? Zoom in the content in a way that I can just perceive better the information. So that's why it's really important for us to understand that. So I can share the presentation to anyone that will be in sharing information. All the reference are there, so you can look about the information. And definitely it's something that, okay? So don't forget to create your user personas. User accessibility personas. Okay, so 2 more slides to finish the conversation. And so usually when we think that accessibility is something that is ugly or it will be difficult to implement, that is not true. Okay, it could take discussions, it could take conversations, it could take ideations, but always it's possible to create accessible content. And sometimes we said we need to create something that will be completely accessible, and there is not possible to create something 100%. So it's necessary for us to understand that we can create something that will be equivalent, or we can create multiple contexts that can help us to create accessible environments in a specific page that is using multiple components that are complex. And of course, always try to create and identify your components in a way that will be accessible as much as possible. For example, if you are using a theme that is accessible already, but there are some specific sections that are not possible to customize, or will prepare yourself, your team, create a specific accessibility, oh my God, I forgot that. Accessibility exceptions, sorry. Accessibility exception document, so you can add all the restrictions that you have with the system. Because it's necessary for you to understand that sometimes we are working with sites that are already created and they didn't think about accessibility at the beginning, and now will be a little bit difficult to implement accessibility. So it would be necessary for you to identify what would be the best strategy to create the content for them and make it accessible. And of course, try to create a set of business that get to understand what like the accessibility go to in terms of their industry and the type of audience that I will prepare. And finally, one of the things that I would like to mention is that always knows the purpose of the visualization. Don't create just visualization because yes, right? Always create visualizations with a meaning. Always try to humanize the visualization as much as possible. Consider the different disabilities that we read at the beginning. Always consider disabilities since the first planning session, not during the coding session or during the testing session, or even after the first launch. No. It's necessary for you to understand that disability needs to be part of the conversation always. And of course, always try to understand what will be like the governance model of your organization. What is the meaning of that? If you are in the United States, what are the specific accessibility laws that you need to follow? If you are in Europe, what are the accessibility standards, normatives that you need to follow in your country? So it will be better when you are informed about the laws, restrictions that can affect your business. So that's all for me. I guess I just met right on time. So thank you so much for joining to this conversation, and I guess we have time for a few questions.
Awesome, Merary, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I have like a bunch of projects that we're currently working on in mind that I need to go apply a bunch of stuff to. I really appreciate it. We had some great questions come in, so we'll get to as many of them as we can in the next few minutes. Real quick, I think you did say that, but we had a question come in about, can you share a link to the presentation so folks can go back and review it later? I think you said yes to that.
Yes.
Okay, great. And I know that if you folks can check back on the page for this session, and presentations will be uploaded if they're shared with the WordPress Accessibility Day team, I believe.
Okay.
Question from Hilda, can you recommend any accessible chart and graph libraries that can be included in WordPress plugins? We want to add charts in the admin of our plugin, but some of the most recommended libraries are prohibitively expensive. They want to charge per installation, which doesn't work for free plugins.
Well, this is a good question. This is a good question because most of the libraries are really expensive. But one of the things that I have experience in two ways, like teams that are fully customizing from scratch all the visualizations, and some of them are using libraries. So I have a couple of references that the charts from Google are really nice. And also there are some libraries from GitHub that you can use, and a couple of references that you can have in terms of how to create visualizations when you are like not in a budget. So definitely it's something that I can share with you at the end of the presentation, definitely.
Awesome. Thank you. I think a lot of people will appreciate that. Someone asked, is there a good resource for all of the different browsers and screen readers?
Resource at
I guess a testing matrix or something like that is how I'm interpreting that.
Well, actually, there is not recommended to test to try to measure how much people is using screen readers in your site. It's against the law. But in the case of recommendations, that I guess your point is like, there are a few good resources like dq.com. They have some open libraries, open resources that you can have all the most recent how-to step by step in how to use multiple screen readers. In fact, in the folder in fact, in the folder that I share with you with the information, you will find like a specific documentation, including the most common screen reader shortcuts. So you can have that information available for you to start, and also share with you a checklist, including the best practices to just create like the first like visualization the best way possible. But also there is something that I can prepare and create for you. So I can just share that with the leaders of the conversation, and they can share that to the team, to the general population.
Amazing. Thank you. Question from Giovanni. In your opinion, how much is the lack of culture around accessibility in both design and programming due to the fact that in many countries, there are no traditional study courses on those topics?
Oh my God, this is sweet. Okay. Why is this important? In the case of accessibility, definitely, there are not many professionals. It's something that definitely, if you are interested in to learn about accessibility, it's something that sometimes that you need to do by yourself. You need to like just become a specific expert, Googling information in regards to accessibility, taking all the trainings available for multiple companies, and all the companies they have multiple points of view in terms of accessibility. So I guess that my best recommendation is read about the best practices per your country or as per your country. So read about the web content accessibility guidelines. Try to understand what are the purposes. Try to read what are the norms that are specifically applied to your country, so you will understand what are the most common disabilities in your country. So you will be familiar with the content that you are created. And there are another types of institutions that for example, DQ.com is DQUniversity.com, for example, is a good resource to start. And also Level Access, the open courses, and Microsoft, it's adding like a good set of accessibility training sessions. So you can start from that.
Yeah, and I know there's a number of efforts to get more universities and more kind of even primary schools starting to work on adding accessibility into their curriculum, but it's a journey to get there. Great question, Giovanni. Thanks. Question from Federico. Is it okay to make a disabled persona? How does that work with all the disabilities to consider? How many disabled personas? Is a persona really adequate for that use case?
Okay. Well, one of the things that I will usually try to recommend is like think about the type of industry that you are working with. Because, for example, if you are working for a company where usually the data that you are creating or the visualization that you are creating implies audience highly technical skilled, you need to think about types of disabilities that are not necessarily physically, like, for example, learning disabilities or cognitive disabilities, right? So this is really important. Mental health is really important. So always think about what will be the major impact through your audience, and based on that, you can create like a matrix of disabilities that can help you to understand. It will be impossible to cover all of them. That will be not possible, but you can think about vision, hearing, mobility, speech, and and cognitive disabilities. Those type of disabilities will be like the most recommended to think about when you are creating content. Great.
Okay, I think we've got time for one last question, and then we'll wrap up. During COVID, we had maps and charts for tracking and sharing data. Our approach was to hide the maps from keyboard users and allow for an alternative approach. This tested really well with our users. One alternative we used was a table which worked but some folks express frustration with the tables, although they expected and could use the tables. Another alternative was to have smaller charts with hidden text to speak the data. This tested extremely well. Do you have any other good alternative approaches to provide the data outside of a giant map or chart or table?
Yes, indeed. Actually, you can create options for the users to download the image. So sometimes it would be not necessary to use a table or like a small description from the graphic, but they want to just take an snapshot or download the image, so they can just download the information to their phones and just use the zoom in or the zoom option, the pinch zoom, to read the information in their own way. So it will be an option also, but the table is always the best way to do. But to that, if you can add like filter controls through your visualization, and you can select the specific options that you want to select to read and understand, that will be also a good idea. And though just download this portion of information, that will also a good idea.
Awesome. Thanks. All right. That does it for our time. Merary, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for attending the session with Merary Alvarado. You can continue the conversation in the chat or on social media using hashtag WPA11YDay and WPAD 2023. We'd also appreciate it if you go to 2023.wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback for our speakers on their presentation. And you can enter to win a t-shirt while you're there. Stay tuned for Going Beyond checklists to build a great course learning experience, coming up with Sandy Gowder at 7 p.m. UTC. And while you're waiting, don't forget to visit our sponsors pages to grab virtual swag and enter for a chance to win great prizes. See you right back here after the break.
Thank you to WordPress Accessibility Day 2023 sponsors. Platinum sponsor, Equalize Digital. Equalize Digital's Accessibility Checker plugin is an automated accessibility scanning tool that helps WordPress websites become and stay accessible. Platinum sponsor, Gravity Forms. Gravity Forms is the professional form builder that you need to create beautiful, powerful, and accessible forms. Gold sponsors, 20i, DQ, Empire Caption Solutions, Pressable, and WP Engine. Silver sponsors, Code Geek, Drake Cooper, GoDaddy, Lone Rock Point, NerdPress, Overnight Website by Kinetic Iris, Riola Networks, A11Y Collective, and The Blogsmith. Bronze sponsors, Accessicart, Green Geeks Web Hosting, Hall Analysis SEO Consulting, HDC, ITX, IvyCat, MetaBox, Pixel Chefs, Simply Schedule Appointments, SiteGround, Termageddon, Underrepresented in Tech, Weglot, and Yoast.